Good to see you.
Charles has moved here.
Ah, uh-huh.
Oh, he hasn't moved here. He's only here a week.
Only here a week. Well, thanks for stopping by.
Thank you for coming. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for coming to today's Stimson Center discussion on the reality and future of Hong Kong. And we all know that since the extradition bill was introduced in June, the development in Hong Kong has been highly disturbing in almost all corners of the world. And there have been a lot of policy discussions in China and in Asia and here in the United States as for what will happen and what needs to be done. So we are honored today to have invited the three top experts on this issue to explain to us or to give us a full picture as for what has happened and what is happening and what will happen in Hong Kong. So for today's panel, we have three distinguished speakers. On my far right, we have Dr. Delina Wright, who is the author of A British Foreign Policy and the Return of Hong Kong to China, and very timely topic. And then in the middle, we have Professor Harry Harding, who was my professor back at GW 15 years ago, who is now the professor of public policy at the University of Virginia. And to my right, we have Professor Shirley Lin, who is adjunct professor of political economy at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. So my understanding, Harry and Shirley, you have been living in Hong Kong and teaching in Hong Kong and coming back and forth among Hong Kong, Taiwan, and mainland. So you have the most first-hand experience as for what has happened. And I know that you were also trapped at the Hong Kong airport during one of the Occupy the Airport days that took place in Hong Kong. So for the sequencing of the discussion today, we would like to invite Delina to start first on the Sino-British negotiation as a background on the OCTS and understanding why we are where we are with the basic law. Then we're going to invite Professor Harding to speak about the recent history of protest in Hong Kong to put the 2019 protests and the political movements in perspective. He will also address implications of the developments in Hong Kong for the United States and US policy. And last but not least, we will invite Professor Lin to talk about Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Beijing perspectives, the different perspectives, and focus on the implication of the developments in Hong Kong for mainland China and for the future unification of cross-strait relation of the Taiwan issue. So without further ado, we will first invite Delina to give us an overview of the British, Sino-British negotiation and what are the implications, what are the political ramifications. Delina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I should say that it took 18 years from the time the British began thinking about this problem and how they were going to solve it. They began thinking about it in earnest in 1979, and handover was 97. So it took 4 prime ministers to basically get the job done. And so that should give you a sense of how complicated this was. And when any significant treaty under any circumstances is negotiated, you know well in this room that things are papered over, promises are made and not kept, or promises are misunderstood, or assertions change over time. And that is the key to understanding what happened in those 18 years, that it was a very long, complicated, protracted process. China changed enormously during this period, and so much of what is happening today, while there are many factors that have happened since handover, and this is really what Shirley and Harry can speak about better than I can, there is an overhang. There are things that are left over that from these negotiations, from the 2 central documents that relate to this. One is the Joint Declaration, which was the agreement, the early agreement, the early agreement between the British and the Chinese as to how they would hand over Hong Kong, and then the second document, which is the basic law. But let me go back and do this in some order. Late 1970s, the British begin to think seriously about this problem, but they devote most of their energies to retaining Hong Kong, not figuring out how to return it because they don't really want to return it. So much creativity, much energy goes into how to keep it. Very little thought is given, surprisingly, to how to return it. So 1982, Margaret Thatcher goes to meet Deng Xiaoping in China. And she carries with her the profound belief after the Falklands that she's going to be able to keep this, and has very difficult time accepting the fact that she has to hand this over. You know about Margaret Thatcher, very anti-authoritarian, anti-communist. She's incredulous that this might happen on her watch, that she has to do this. She gets into the meeting with Deng Xiaoping, and Deng Xiaoping tells her 2 things. 1, he's taking it. 2, that he will allow 2 years of negotiations and no more to figure out the mechanism by which this transfer will take place. And he says, if you don't do this in 2 years, I'm going to unilaterally announce that we're taking it over. So that was the challenge for both sides, in fact. And because the Chinese sort of had thought more about this than the British, they really, in effect, bailed the British out by coming up with the 1 country, 2 systems concept, which had been written for Taiwan years and years before. But they now adopt it, and they say that we will allow this autonomy, we will allow these 2 systems, we will allow capitalism. And remember, that he's saying this in 1982, so this is pretty amazing stuff for 82. So he, deep down inside of Deng Xiaoping during this period, he could have been a New York ad man, because he comes up with all these wonderful expressions, 1 country, 2 systems being the main one. But he says Hong Kong people will run Hong Kong, which was a slap in the face of the British. He would always send somebody from London to do this. So he's saying you will have these advantages under us. He says, people who join the Hong Kong government after handover, they can criticize China as long as they're patriots. He says you can still go to Happy Valley and bet on the horses. So he's really the New York ad man for this process, because what he does not want to have happen is that he inherits a truculent population, doesn't want to be part of China. There's capital flight, emigration of professionals, and his worry is the same as Britain's worry. He just has a way of giving hope to the process. But the reason I raised the 2-year issue is that Margaret Thatcher spent about a year being unwilling to really negotiate seriously about giving it back. So the end of the story is the entire negotiation that was meant to be in 2 years takes place in 3/4 of a year. And one of the things that does not happen for those 3/4 of a year is a fruitful discussion about governance. Democracy, no democracy, whatever it is virtually not discussed in any serious way. And so and what Deng Xiaoping is holding to is, I've given you the 12 points that would govern any handover, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and it's about autonomy, but if we get to governance, that's not the British issue, that's the Chinese issue. So we don't want anything in this joint declaration that we're negotiating on governance. The British persuade the Chinese that they have to do something, and they give them the language 2 weeks before the scheduled initialing of the joint declaration. And this causes an enormous amount of pressure all the way around. And the British persuade the Chinese that if you really don't want a truculent population, if you really want a population that will accept this, you must say something about governance. And in addition, we can't get it through Parliament. We won't be able to ratify this. So they accept the language, which is basic. They modify it, but they accept the language which is what we're living with today. And that is the language in the joint declaration, which, if you read it on the surface, is so pleasant. It talks about elections. It talks about the choice of chief executive, possibly by consensus, possibly by elections. And the world is very pleased. What happens immediately afterwards is that the British start to go to town on this. They start to put out white papers, and it's so modest what they were going to do. It was absolutely so unradical. But it was opening up the system from an entirely appointed legislature to a legislature that had some semblance of functional constituencies, which meant that each sort of occupation would put somebody into the legislature. In addition, Parliament has this debate, and it's all about democracy. And if you look at it forensically, it's fine. The ministers don't say democracy is coming, but the aura is left in the room. Chinese get very upset about this, and it's now 1985, and they want out of this. And what you see at this moment is what you're living with today in a way, which is the sense that the British used elections, the hidden hand, the black hand, to have continued influence. They never brought elections before this. They never did this. They have to give it back, and they don't want to, so they will use elections. And this begins the belief about foreign interference. And so the British come up with the idea of convergence, which means we won't get ahead of you, China. We will, between now and handover, we will take on board what you need in terms of a constricted electoral law, which takes you to the second document, which is the Basic Law. And that is where they begin to, am I going too long? They begin to think about how now they're going to structure the government. But what happens in the middle of the deliberations on this Basic Law, which is basically a constitution, and it is China's to give. The British are on the outside of this, but they're trying to influence. Tiananmen happens. And they stop the Basic Law deliberations, they come back to it. But everything has changed. So what you end up with is a slightly more liberal view of LegCo, because they know that the world is watching, and they allow for, but they put into place a more restrictive, what you probably have heard of as Article 23, which is they begin to look at treason and sedition and these kinds of issues more seriously. And so you're now left with this suspicion about what elections means, that it's foreign interference. You get the sense that they've been forced into this, and now the joint declaration is tarnished in their minds, which is why you also see today these utterances that come out of the Chinese government that says it's a discredited document, it doesn't count anymore, it was just a historic document, and that is legally not true. But you get to the point in 97, you have the Chris Patton years, you have wrangling again about the makeup of the LegCo. But what nobody thinks about at that point is the chief executive. But the thing that's in the Basic Law says this is a government that will be led by a strong chief executive, and oh, by the way, we're going to pick that chief executive. We're going to have a construct to get you there, but we are always going to pick that chief executive. So what you end up with after 97 is the attention is now focused on the chief executive, and China insists to this day on picking the chief executive, and allows a lot of fuzzy stuff going on in the LegCo, but insists upon the chief executive. And what you see, and I'll sort of close with this, but what you see there is a chief executive that cannot do the job under the terms of the Basic Law, because China basically hires the chief executive and says, when there's an extradition law, we will tell you how it will come down. When there is a sedition law, which was what happened and brought the first set of demonstrations in 2003, we will tell you how it works. On the other hand, the Basic Law says Hong Kong has autonomy, the chief executive is supposed to be representing the people of Hong Kong. It is, and this is the great flaw in the creation of the Basic Law, which is what we live with today. And so when you have something like Article 23, which was about treason and sedition, China said in 2003, enact this law. The chief executive said, okay, we will do this, but the chief executive had no gifts for selling this to the people of Hong Kong. The people of Hong Kong couldn't believe that the legislature would be able to temper these laws, would be able to debate these laws, would be able to ameliorate the worst of it, and they went to the streets. And thus began what you see today, which is when the people of Hong Kong feel that they're menaced by a potential law or menaced by a policy, that they can't rely on the LegCo, they cannot rely on the chief executive, and the last resort is to go to the streets.
That's terrific. Thank you so much.
That is
Linda.
like 18 years of history.
Yeah, that's terrific. I think when people look at the reality today, the part of the history and especially the negotiation between China and the British over what was going to happen in Hong Kong is very much neglected in the discussion today. And on the issue of the chief executive, I particularly agree with your analysis because the setting basically dictates that chief executive serves two masters, serves Beijing and serves Hong Kong people. Right. And although Beijing would like to argue that these two are identical, but in reality, when there are indeed disagreements, it becomes a question as well, whom should the chief executive really serve and represent?
Well, and you have a jurisdictional question, but you also have a personality question. They've never selected people who had those gifts to be able to imagine how this could be done. And so you have a dual problem.
Absolutely. So moving on, coming to the more recent history of the protests and political struggle in Hong Kong and the protests this year, Professor Harry Harding.
Thank you very
Please
much.
enlighten us.
Thank you. How many of you, I know some of you, but how many of you were actually there at the time of the handover on June 30, July 1, 1997? Okay, so we have a few.
Fine.
And I was there as well. I was actually the guest of what you could say was the incoming Hong Kong government. And it was a very interesting moment. The weather was terrible, but I would say that the public reaction at the time was extremely optimistic, in fact, celebratory. There was no sense of impending doom at all. There was a trust in one country, two systems. If there was tension in the air, and there was, it was between the outgoing British authorities and the incoming Chinese authorities for the understandable reasons, because of some of the bad blood that have been created by these maneuvers and negotiations that Delina has described so well. The one thing that happened that in retrospect was a kind of a harbinger of things to come was C.H. Tung, the new first Hong Kong Chinese chief executive, inaugural speech. He rose to deliver it, opened his mouth, and out comes Cantonese. The high officials from Beijing, the looks on their faces was priceless. What? Because they couldn't understand a word he was saying. They suddenly realized why there were the earphones and the transmission devices, and they fumbled to put this on to figure out what was going on. And that was an early warning that the question of what does the word Chinese, as in Chinese language, mean in these important documents. Obviously, they thought it meant Mandarin. He thought, and the people of Hong Kong still argue passionately, it is Cantonese. And so again, a fundamental foundational issue that's not been resolved. So my point is that the handover was widely welcomed. But within a few years, protests began. And they were exactly as Delina described in passing. They were protests that were reactive. I call them reactive, populist, and nostalgic. Reactive to what they saw as attempts by either the central government or the Hong Kong government to erode Hong Kong's promised autonomy, erode its identity, and erode its values. Focused on a number of initiatives that were undertaken by either Beijing or Hong Kong government or both, and even though those initiatives would have arguably have had clear economic benefits for Hong Kong. So it was reactive. It was now increasingly populist. This is a bottom-up movement without clear leaders. Please do not give too much weight to the idea that these are all sponsored by, again, the black hand from outside. I don't think any black hand from outside is powerful enough to routinely bring 1 million people into the streets of Hong Kong. And it is nostalgic in the sense that it is looking backward to an idealized past. Whether or not that past ever actually existed is really beside the point. The term that the main slogan that the demonstrators use, which in the Mandarin is Guangfu Xianggang, is mistranslated as liberate. We know how to say liberate in Chinese, as Jiefang is in Jiefang Jun, Liberation Army. Guangfu is familiar to anybody who spent any time in Taiwan, Guangfu Dalu. And it means to recover, to restore, to turn the clock back in a way. And that is, in a sense, what the people of Hong Kong are saying. We remember a past that we may be glorifying, but still we're passionate about it. What was that past? I think it depends on who you ask. For some, it would simply be the years of go-go growth in Hong Kong, rapid economic growth and a sense of growing opportunity for everyone. Others would say it was the flowering of Hong Kong Cantonese Canto pop culture. It was a time that Hong Kong had enormous cultural impact, especially on the mainland, but also on the entire Chinese, or at least Cantonese-speaking world. And it was a time when Hong Kong people still had faith in some of their fundamental governing values and institutions, freedom of speech, the rule of law, a police force that you could trust once corruption had been largely dealt with. And so it is backward-looking more than it is forward-looking to a brighter future, although that's becoming an increasing part of it. Please tell Mr. Apple that iPhones don't need to shut down after 5 seconds. Anyway. So what were some of the major demonstrations that reflected this sort of nostalgic, protective, defensive attitude among the Hong Kong people? Let me remind you of some of the main protests and what they were focused on. First, an attempt to begin to have moral and national, sometimes it was moral and civic, education in the schools. This was widely seen by both parents and teachers as an attempt to basically propagandize an official history of China from the mainland's perspective. That was one of the first protests, and it rolled back that initiative. Another one was the national security legislation that, as Delina says, was promised in the joint declaration and the basic law, but to this day has not been adopted by the Hong Kong government, proposed or adopted by the legislature. It's called Article 23 legislation. One of the most interesting, because it reflects some of the other aspects of this nostalgia, were the huge protests against the demolition of the Queen's Pier. What this suggests is that a country or a city's identity is reflected in its architecture, as well as in its institutions and values. And this Queen's Pier, which was the ceremonial point of arrival for incoming British governors, had a huge emotional appeal to Hong Kongers who saw its proposed destruction as a step in eroding their history and their identity. More recently, protests against the high-speed rail line that would connect Hong Kong, West Kowloon in particular, with the national high-speed network. Both the idea of closer connectivity was a threat to many as a way in which the mainland would spread its influence on a constant basis into Hong Kong, and especially the proposal now adopted that mainland Chinese customs and immigration officials would be stationed on Hong Kong territory in the station, and that part of the station would be deemed to be part of the mainland. The National Palace Museum proposed a branch in Hong Kong in the West Kowloon Cultural District. You would think that would be a wonderful tourist attraction, but again, massive protests on the grounds that this was extending the mainland's cultural influence in. We saw there was a picture of the proposed museum in Hong Kong Central Station, one of the MTR stations that's recently been attacked by the protesters, and there were protests of young people sitting against this big picture of the coming National Palace Museum branch, and the caption said in Mandarin, "Mama, 我饿，可是我吃不下." Mom, I'm hungry, but I can't eat because of this thing looming up in the background. And of course, the most dramatic protests were over the proposed electoral reforms in 2014 that the Hong Kong people felt had been promised were too limited for exactly the reasons that Delina mentioned, that Beijing would maintain control over who was nominated and who was eventually selected. Now, all of these protests were on top of regular protests, regularly scheduled protests on major dates. October 1st, National Day, which is of course coming up in just a week or so, and June 4th, which regularly have had protests of various sizes over the years. So this has been a nostalgic and to some degree increasingly aspirational populism to protect or restore an idealized past, and now increasingly to promote an aspirational future that was promised, although never previously achieved. I think for China, what this means is that the humiliation, that the seizure of Hong Kong as a British colony in the 19th century, the humiliation continues, that they have not been able to make it Chinese, to make it mainlandized. And surely we'll talk about some of the ways that we know about this. They've been cracking down very hard on the protesters, as we know, but despite the crackdown, I believe the protests are going to continue. And I think that they are going to be focused increasingly not only on some of these old issues, but on new issues that I think will emerge as China tries to push the process of mainlandization forward. I think there is now vanishingly small chance that the one country, two systems formula will be continued after 2047. Some people think that the documents say will be continued for at least 50 years. There was one statement by Deng Xiaoping that did suggest perhaps it could be extended. You don't hear that quoted anymore, and I don't think there is much chance in the world that Beijing will allow the arrangement to continue. And if it is not going to continue, you have to push to reduce the gap between Hong Kong and the mainland so that basically not much happens in 2047. It's all happened before. You don't want to wait until the last minute. And so you need to start changing Hong Kong, and those attempts to change it, I predict, will be the cause of more protests in the future. Where will the Chinese pressure be seen? I suspect it will be on a number of key institutions. It will be on the press, on the media, on the schools. If anybody has a copy of this morning's print edition of the Washington Post, apparently there is some kind of advertisement that says, what is now the standard line, that the liberal education in the Hong Kong school system needs to be, liberal studies, thank you, Shirley, needs to be reconsidered. That it is training young people to think for themselves. What a horrible thought. I'm not sure the person who wrote me about it says brainwashing. That would be very ironic, since the word, wash the brain is, of course, the Chinese Communist term, as anybody who knows brainwashing during the Korean War can attest to. So the school system, reintroduce national and moral education proposals, pressures on the courts, especially as how they deal with those who have been accused of illegal assembly, failure to disperse, rioting, run through the courts, increasing pressures on Hong Kong businesses, especially pressures on major corporations to fire or penalize those who have expressed sympathy, let alone participated in the protests, and of course to control all elections through the process of disqualifying those who are believed as not being sufficiently patriotic. So I see that the protests will continue because the attempts to restrict some of these basic institutions and freedoms that the Hong Kong people have come to value and cherish, they will continue as well. Now, what are the implications for the United States? Hong Kong has rarely been an issue for the United States. It was a small issue at the time of the first handover, the handover back to the British. There are wonderful historical photographs of the ceremony down near where Queen's Pier was that had two flagpoles. One was with the British flag and one was with the flag of the Republic of China. In other words, it was not quite clear to whom it was going to be returned. If Franklin Roosevelt had still been president, it might have gone the other way. But of course, it went back to the British. Despite the anti-colonial mood that was beginning to arise at that period of time. During the Cold War, we had to figure how to square our attempt to embargo China with the desperate need of Hong Kong for food, water, and other goods from China. We had to balance the British Hong Kong's needs and our China policy. But when it came to the handover, the optimism that was evident at the time of the handover ceremonies in Hong Kong was reflected here as well. We were very optimistic about it. And while many members of Congress came to visit Hong Kong during the build-up to the handover, there was a sense that basically we would provide Hong Kong with what I call most favored city status. Not most favored nation, but that we would continue to treat it separately from the mainland. Even after China entered the WTO. In terms of having its own tariff schedule, that could be lower than that was tariffs for the mainland, and above all, that we would continue to trust the Hong Kong government to apply technology transfer restrictions. So both in terms of technology and in terms of tariff. Hong Kong would continue to be treated as a separate customs and tariff territory. Now, in the last several months, Hong Kong has begun to enter the Washington agenda more than at any time in the past, with enormous concern about what is happening. Human rights in general is coming to the fore again, especially focused on the Muslims in Xinjiang, and especially there and now in the Ningxia area as well. And Hong Kong is simply another example of this. And the issues that are facing the U.S. Congress mainly are the following. Number one, should we revoke what I'm calling Hong Kong's most favored city status? The Hong Kong Policy Act, which gave that status to Hong Kong, by a voice vote in, I believe in both houses of Congress, certainly an enormous, overwhelming majority, premised that status on the Chinese government maintaining its position of giving Hong Kong not complete autonomy, but a high degree of autonomy, except in defense and foreign affairs where there's no autonomy. And the idea is to ask how much autonomy does Hong Kong still have? The State Department has been required for a number of years to do an annual reporting on this. The last one said that the degree of autonomy was adequate but diminished, which was a clear warning both to Hong Kong and to Beijing that the next time the reporting rolls around, which is probably going to be next year, March, but could be sooner if Congress presses for it, the result might be somewhat different. This, by the way, is why both Hong Kong and Beijing insist that Hong Kong is acting on its own. That basically when the Hong Kong government decides to crack down, when Carrie Lam decides that she is not going to resign, all of these things are being done autonomously because you cannot acknowledge that Beijing is, in any fundamental sense, calling the shots. So that will be a huge issue. Should we revoke most favored city status? That would obviously have widespread harm to people of Hong Kong. It's not a targeted sanction, but it is something that is under active consideration. There's other legislation. There's a Protect Hong Kong Act which is now beginning to come up in Congress, which would prohibit the export of basically non-lethal, even non-lethal law enforcement equipment to the Hong Kong police force. And most controversially, there is the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which would not just authorize, but appears, and I cannot imagine it will not be amended and changed to remove the mandate. It mandates the executive branch to impose financial sanction on those people in Hong Kong, officials in Hong Kong who have arguably violated the basic human rights of the Hong Kong people, including but not exclusively referring to the kidnapping of the booksellers in Causeway Bay who published books that were critical of Xi Jinping. So as always, as after June 4th, we have to decide, other than expressing outrage and concern, can we go further? Should we go further to impose economic or financial sanctions, given the possibility of retaliation by Beijing against comparable American individuals and interests, and if those sanctions end up harming the ordinary people of Hong Kong as much as they do the government? So I think the number of people here today suggests how suddenly Hong Kong has attracted attention, not just as a wonderful city to visit, or in our case, to live in, but as a policy dilemma for the United States. Turn it over to Shirley.
Thank you, Professor Harding. I think you really get to the center of the almost a mosaic nature of the issue in Hong Kong that we're facing today. There are positive elements, but there are also a lot of negative elements. On the issue of autonomy, for example, although we seem to see that autonomy is observed, but like what Delina said, if Beijing maintains the control and the approval of the candidates of the chief executive for Hong Kong, then that's not very autonomous to begin with. But then moving forward, we look at the issue of the one country, two systems and the implication for Taiwan, because there are a lot of observations believing that what has happened in Hong Kong has been a God-sent gift to Tsai Ing-wen and the DPP administration in Taiwan. And this is terrific news. It shows the gloomy nature and the future of the one country, two system, and how it adds to the popularity to the policy platforms of the DPP administration currently in Taiwan. Is that true, Professor Liu?
I guess I want to start off by asking, how many of you here have seen the movie that is, of course, banned in China called 10 Years? Very few? Okay, so 5. So this is a movie that was made in 2015 and immediately became the best film, received the Best Film Award, which, of course, accompanies with its glory is it's banned in China. And in this movie that has 5 vignettes, one of the vignettes is about, basically the whole movie is about dystopia in Hong Kong in 2025, 10 years from when it was made, as to what happens in 10 years when people lose hope in one country, two system. At the time the movie came out, we brought some professors from the United States to see it. Only ticket left were on the first row seats. Very uncomfortable, and it was totally packed. And the friend we took came back and said, totally ridiculous movie. Because how could this be possible? In one of the stories, 2 people killed themselves, one by burning herself. And when you look at it, you thought, okay, that was then. This year, this summer, we live 5 minutes from the beginning of the protest, which is Victoria Park. And so almost on a daily basis, at least every weekend, we saw the protesters, whether we were going to the protest or not. We were surrounded by them. And as you know, 5 people killed themselves, and the youngest, was a 21-year-old woman who majored in music at the University of Education. And the 21-year-old left a note on the wall that says, if my life can bring back the hope of 2 million people, it will be worth it. Something, it's in Chinese. And when you think about it, the movie wasn't actually so unrealistic. Because the movie is about 2025 when people do not believe that 2047 is really the deadline for the end of one country, two system. So with that as the background, I'm tasked with the most narrow questions, since the smarter ones on the panel already addressed the macro, the long-term temporal and spatial issue, and the implications. I will address the immediate cause of the protest, which is what I've been studying as a political economist for many years, along with studying Taiwan. And for a long time, they were not connected. But I've been saying that they are connected. But I would say the older generation in both Hong Kong and Taiwan never really quite saw the destiny of the two places as being one. But over the years that I've been teaching in Taiwan and in Beijing and in Hong Kong, it's very clear to me. The younger generation, in addition to fighting for sustainability, care very deeply about freedom, democracy, and view younger people on the other side of the strait as really part of the same generation. And this protest this year really underscores that. So the two issues I'm going to address is first, the immediate cause, which is actually quite interestingly, although I've been writing and saying this for years, Beijing is now acknowledging it in a very interesting way and twisting it, which is the socioeconomic problems of Hong Kong, the entire structure. And it goes way back to colonial rule. But the second point I'm going to make is the three implications for Beijing. I believe Beijing has this biggest dilemma, more than any of the other actors we are talking about, more than actually Hong Kong people. But of course, for Hong Kong people, it is life and death. So the first point is that Hong Kong is in a high-income trap, which is what I'm writing about, which challenges any policymaker. No policymaker has been able to really resolve the issues associated with the trap, which is, of course, we know Hong Kong has thrived with China's economic rise. It has benefited, it has grown faster than other economies in East Asia, even while it has become a service economy. However, this year, of course, it is going to lag far behind, for example, Taiwan, and anything that happens that relates to China, of course, hurts Hong Kong even more. So its high-income trap is much worse than other places, whether it's Seoul, Taipei, or Singapore, including slow growth, as I just said, stagnating wages, demographic decline. It has one of the lowest fertility rates in the world, and a very fast aging population with excellent health care. Inequalities and financialization. Finance is a bigger and bigger part of Hong Kong, even though it's already dominated by finance and real estate. For Hong Kong's young people, just imagine this. I'm sure you see this even in today's newspaper. I think it's mentioned every other day in Hong Kong's newspaper. Basically, that the city's median annual household income is $54,000, and a medium apartment is $1.1 million US dollar. So that price ratio is what everyone knows in Hong Kong. It's 21 times. So with that kind of structure, what it really means for the students I've been teaching for the last 10 years is they're not interested in money per se. They're not interested because they're never going to buy an apartment. Never mind North Point or Tung Chung. They're just not going to do it. So not getting married, not having children, not buying a car, not even having a pet, the vets are very expensive, and not having an apartment means that their incentives are very different than the older generation, which makes it very difficult for old policymakers to understand how to incentivize and nudge young people to do, quote, the right thing. So these structural issues are very difficult, but they're exacerbated by the fact that the only solution Hong Kong government has always thought and said is plausible is to find help from China, whether it's SARS, whether it's growth, whether it's low matriculation in colleges. Let's just ask China for help. So the only solution is also the biggest threat to Hong Kong culture and identity. There are so many wealthy business families now increasingly from China that have a say in how the city is governed, it appears, whereas people in working class and middle class in Hong Kong don't seem to have any say for over 100 years in how the city is run. So in terms of inequality, I'm sure you all know that Hong Kong is worse in terms of inequality than any other OECD economies in the world. The difference between Hong Kong and Brazil, or Shanghai, is that the rich and the poor live side by side, very closely together, with obvious contrast in a very dense city. So what does this all mean? Well, I think Hong Kong, as Harry and Delina already pointed out, you can imagine it's not just about the money, because it's post-materialist, some would call it. I think those are abstract terms that mean nothing. Simply means that These immediate causes are important, but they are not the only reason. They are actually part and parcel of the value differential, and this is what is the challenge for Beijing. Beijing, because of this year's protest, has three challenges that has always been there, but it's now exaggerated in a way that the world has taken notice, as Harry says. All three issues relate to one word, and that is trust. There is no way to build trust easily, but it is very easy to take it down. Beijing's response to the Hong Kong protests is ending trust on all fronts and hurting Beijing's intentions in terms of its strategic goals. So first, and the most important that we read about in Wall Street Journal and Financial Times, is that Hong Kong as a financial center will be hurt. Absolutely. But we have to remember, actually, Hong Kong has the most liquid and international capital markets in Asia, and it cannot be replaced very easily. If you look at all of the reports, everyone has a contingency plan, whether it's a hedge fund or a multinational corporation. But of course, can Shanghai and Shenzhen replace Hong Kong? I contend not for a very long time, and not only that, if the US-China trade war continues and more intensely, Hong Kong will become even more important, not less. So that presents a very big dilemma for Beijing. Just as Hong Kong may not be more than 3% of China's GDP because of the way GDP is calculated, a decoupling means that Hong Kong is front and center because trust is what investors have in Hong Kong. A market with professional regulators, a common law system, an independent judiciary, arbitration, these are things that you can't ask financial actors to just go off and move to Singapore. There is fairness and independence, but specifically, Chinese companies now are 68% of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Foreign investors have always viewed Hong Kong as a gateway to China. But the amount of capital flow actually going with the connect mechanisms that you know about to China is very small, 500 billion or so. So actually, if Hong Kong money were to flow out of Hong Kong, it would hurt China a lot more than it would hurt the funds, the American funds or the Western companies. Many multinational companies are thinking about contingency. Harry and I just gave a talk at AmCham in Hong Kong right before we came to start our semester here, and everyone is thinking about what to do, how to pull out. Is this a Tiananmen? Is this the Minsky moment? But I think that what is very important to remember is however unlikely financial sanctions can change state behavior. The U.S. looking at ways to sanction Hong Kong through the Equitable Act, which means companies like Alibaba, which are listed in the United States, has to follow more stringent requirement than how we deal with foreign companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange. The Magnitsky Act, or Hong Kong Democracy and Human Rights Act, all serve as an alarm bell to what Harry was talking about, and actually will be very alarming for Beijing because, most importantly, Beijing's elites and families and companies flow their capital through Hong Kong. It is not the American capital that is being hurt. More than anything, it's Beijing's capital. For the elites, this will hurt their own status, and for individuals who might be sanctioned, who have brownstones in New York City, this is extremely frightening for all of those students we teach in the United States. So the other point is the relationship between government and business in Hong Kong is very important. It is how the Brits used to run the city, it is how Beijing continues to run the city, and this is also being hurt. Real estate and financial companies have been the most important companies that keeps a city actually stable. But in recent weeks, you see a really very nuanced change in Beijing's attitude. In state-owned media, they're now attacking real estate companies in Hong Kong for leading to the inequity. And this is something actually quite nuanced but very important, because this trust between what you call the collusive forces in Hong Kong is also breaking down, and there's been calls for more state-owned enterprises to come into Hong Kong, buy property, buy asset, to help stabilize, provide housing. Just this morning, New World decided to give up farmland to provide for housing in Hong Kong. You wonder, how did a real estate company just wake up one morning and decide to give away land to provide welfare? So there's something very interesting that would also destabilize the city. As Harry says, many companies have been caught between doing what is politically correct and asked for, and upholding the freedom of speech and assembly, and simply being a good company with good corporate governance. So the second implication, of course, is Taiwan, something I'm deeply concerned about. Beijing is very concerned, and so people say, well, it's challenging to talk today. In a few days, it's national holiday. We've been hearing this all throughout June, July, and August. Isn't something going to happen before October 1? Isn't something going to happen before November 12? Isn't something going to happen before January 11? Many, many days for you to think about, but no. I'm putting myself out here since it's all these dates coming up. I don't believe. I think the game is to wait it out because Taiwan's election is January 11, 2020. Right now, it doesn't look very good for Beijing. For the first time ever, KMT has a candidate who is actually not U.S. educated, does not really speak English, and is openly saying that if we work with China, we can have more peace, stability, and prosperity. Well, it seems like it's sort of 1.0 version campaigning. This is now 2019. That doesn't seem to be working very well. As Sun Ying said, of course, the DPP is also torn between how much to support Hong Kong, how much to focus on working with the United States. All of these have detractors, of course, but all in all, Hong Kong is no help to what Beijing is trying to accomplish in Taiwan, which has taken 30 years. And just as I was speaking just here at Stimson 2 years ago, that Xi Jinping was seeing some small results that he was very happy about, especially last October. Right before the November midterm election, I think Xi Jinping was probably celebrating because for the first time, polls show that more Taiwanese actually say they're both Taiwanese and Chinese, and slowly a lot more, about 4% increase in people who say maybe unification eventually is what I will support. For 30 years, there was no uptick until Xi Jinping started to provide bigger sticks and sweeter carrots. But in a few months, it's completely destroyed. And all the numbers this year, mid-year, if you follow, have reversed now back to what it was. People don't support one country, two system, don't support unification, and are not feeling Chinese. So I think that very few Taiwanese are willing to talk about how it is to work with China. It is a non-starter for any politician. It's political suicide. And many, of course, Taiwanese say that the parallels are incredible. Many Hong Kongers hope that today's democratic and autonomous Taiwan is tomorrow's Hong Kong. And many Taiwanese fear that today's Hong Kong, falling under increasing Chinese influence, is tomorrow's Taiwan. An overwhelming 70% of Taiwanese under 40 years old support the protest, not the older generation, and feel that they should band together. There's no trust between Beijing and Taiwanese people, especially younger ones, 500,000 of which will vote for the first time in January, and who are the biggest swing vote. So the third and most important point is just like Taiwanese often have said in the last few decades, Hong Kong should be viewed as an end in itself. Hong Kong should be governed better for the benefit of Hong Kong people. I think that it's very important from Beijing's point of view to show that China is willing to honor the commitment included in one country, two system, but also its ability to accept diversity of values and opinions within its own borders, to govern a people that was increasingly more patriotic from 1997 to 2008. And then since 2012, decreasingly patriotic and decreasing trust in the Hong Kong government, in the Beijing government. I just looked at the polls this very morning. The people who are not confident in Hong Kong's future in Hong Kong is 52%, and people who do not believe in one country, two system is 62%. All-time high. For the last 22 years, you've never seen this kind of number. So the situation is very disconcerting. But in essence, Beijing needs to govern Hong Kong better for not only to show the world, but really to build confidence that it can rule a land with such diversity and values. And difference in history is not going to bar people from being together in a nation. Regardless of all of your opinion here, and we've been to many, many contested talks, so I'm very used to it, and bring them on, as Sun Ying says, spicy questions later on. But regardless of what you think about the protest, the violence, having been caught on the June 12th, the first time they were actually using tear gas, I feel very strongly with most of my students going to the streets, and most of them are women. This is really, really amazing. Young women, old women, mothers who bring their children onto the street. It is quite different than 5 years ago, where it was a smaller group and more students. You have really across, would you say, the business community, the families, the middle class, the working class, the young students, all working together. There is no doubt in my mind that there are more Hong Kongers who are against what the government is doing, how Beijing and the Hong Kong government are responding, and more dissatisfied with governance today than satisfied, even if there is all this talk about intervention. Strip away all of that. There's simply more people unhappy with political, economic, and social situation in Hong Kong, and you can see that in the polls today. The polls, of course, have been discontinued miraculously in June, but continue on a separate way. If you just type in Hong Kong, you pop, it will lead you to the new site. So again, trust is lost between the governments, the two governments, Hong Kong and Beijing, and Hong Kongers, and that is something that is very hard to regain. So to conclude, as a resident of Hong Kong since 1982, engaging with young people, I see the gap between China and Hong Kong growing every day, especially in the last few years. With Hong Kong's distinctive identity being eroded by what Harry just talked about, mainlandization of Hong Kong, and recent protests go far beyond economic issues. It's not housing, it's not just redistribution, it's not just let's give away the excess land tax money that we received. It is very much focused on what the younger generation care about: core values, freedom, democracy, our environment, what is happening to the world. And 2047, I think something that it's so wonderful to be on a panel with a historian who knows really what's going on. At the time of all of this discussion of course, the basic law, one country, two system, very few people at the table thought they would be there in 2047. And we've come to the point where everybody, including my own children raised in Hong Kong, say, well, what will happen to my kids when they grow up?
I think the response from the audience attests to the insightfulness of the analysis by all three speakers. And Professor Lin, I particularly appreciate your expression of hope that the mainland government would be taking a more tolerant attitude towards the political development in Hong Kong and support or tolerate the diversification, the pluralism that is thriving in the Hong Kong society. Of course, that is a hope. But I guess my question is, when we look at how mainland government has dealt with the protests in Hong Kong and the political development, it doesn't confer a lot of confidence, does it?
Well, I appreciate this, Sun Yin, as your first comment, because I've been in several panels where everyone is always being one more depressed than the other. And then I'm always asked to say a few things. So just on the way here, I said to Harry, I'm going to change my remarks. Instead of implications for Beijing, I'm going to talk about what Beijing should do for its own benefit, so deflect the depressing part of it, which is so far what they have done. I think looking forward is very important. I've always been very hopeful, and that's why I live in Hong Kong. People ask me, are you packing up your bags and getting ready to go? And I said, no, not at all. But a lot of people are leaving. For the first time, there's a surge in Hong Kong people moving to Taiwan. It's been surging, it's been increasing for the last few years, but this year we have a record number of people. And my students ask me very often, should I move to Taiwan? And I said, from Hong Kong, from one dangerous place to another.
With that optimistic note, we will open up for questions and answers. I have two requests. The first one is that you identify yourself, and the second one is please be brief with your question. If you're going to make a remark, please limit it to 1 minute. So let's move ahead. Let's start with a younger observer in the back.
Hi, my name is Paul Lee from the U.S. Institute of Peace. I have two quick questions. One is the structure in which members of the Legislative Council are elected in Hong Kong. As you know, some are elected directly by district, others are by sector. So some argue that this leads to more pro-Beijing members from the sectoral ones. How did this come about? Is this a legacy of the British system, or was this Beijing's idea? And would changing this make Hong Kong people happier? And then the second question is about the British legacy. A lot of young people are flying British flags during the protests. Is this a misinformed nostalgia to go back to a past when there was no democracy? Or, yeah, how do you feel about this feeling?
Electoral
Well, it was iterative, is what happened. I should say that the person who dreamed up functional constituencies has moved to France and cannot be found. I've tried. As I said earlier, is that China really loved what they found in 1984. They loved the fact that it was a strong chief executive, the governor, and they loved the fact that it was an appointed legislature. And what they basically thought was, that's what we'll have. And really, no one anticipated, even the British side, anticipated that this would become unacceptable. It had been acceptable, for 150 years. So no one really anticipated that it would become unacceptable. And everybody banked on the fact that through the 1980s, before Tiananmen, that, we'll open it a little bit. We'll make it feel a little more inclusive. And when they created functional constituencies, which in effect are small sector ways of, so all the accountants will vote for an accountant to be in the legislature. The lawyers would vote for a lawyer. And if you know about Martin Lee, Martin Lee came in that way into politics. He was the lawyer's choice, in 1985. So the idea that Teddy Youde had, who was the governor, was we want to build a political class. And so we will ask all of these different employee groups, the bankers, the accountants, to start putting people forward to be a political class. They didn't see it as democracy. They just saw it as bigger tent for what would be a quasi-appointed government. Tiananmen, the pressure began to build in the 80s, and it really built after Tiananmen, which was for direct elections. But what you ended up with now is a hybrid. You end up where, in effect, the people who are elected, directly elected, are your opposition. The people who really run things are the people who come in through functional constituencies, come in because China is able to weigh the selection process. And so you have a system where the opposition can get nowhere and has to be obstreperous and has to be very dramatic in how they make their points because that's all they've got. And so there are things to be nostalgic about the British system. I mean, there was, the attention to corruption, the fact that they did do a lot in the 70s to bring in housing, to bring in social welfare policies, to bring in labor policies. There is a lot to be nostalgic about in that sense. It was good governance. There's nothing to be nostalgic about in terms of institution building. They did not build the institutions. They did not get people ready for this participation, and that is why you have so much confrontation as a way of expressing views.
I'm going to say something because I know Harry will have a very thorough answer. But I just want to preempt a question that comes out of this question, which is people say there was no democracy. Why are the students flying these flags? And why are they so nostalgic about an authoritarian past where the emperor was in London? It's just a different place. I have come up with my answer now, and that is 2019 is simply not the same as at the same, basically you look at your neighbors. Taiwan was an authoritarian government, and so was South Korea. So it's very different. We live in a different world. We cannot tell young people just to look back and say, well, why are you not appreciative of how far we've come? And simply say that not having democracy in the past means not having democracy now is the same. The world has changed, and I just want to add that before Harry.
A lot of pressure, Harry.
When Shirley says very full answer, that means Harry's going to talk too much. But I'm not going to talk very much at all. I think that, as I said, this is, as nostalgia often is, it is nostalgia for an idealized past. It's also a commitment to values. And we Americans know that there is often, and we see it now increasingly in the United States, a gap between values, between the ideal design and operation of institutions, and the reality. And as we continue to confront the problems of racism, poverty, injustice, the list goes on in the United States, we are criticizing the reality by reference to the values. And I think that that's what's happening in Hong Kong. It's not that they are thinking that everything was wonderful under British colonial rule, but rather they have been, not brainwashed, but educated to respect and adopt the values that underlie Western democratic political systems and institutions. And I mentioned some of them, in particularly freedom of information, freedom of the press. This is a constant. I'll be going to a conference in Hong Kong in a month or so. That's going to be, they said they're going to buy me the tickets. Haven't changed their mind yet. On the so-called Greater Bay Area. This is Beijing's plan to, depending on how you want to, what verb you want to use, incorporate Hong Kong or submerge Hong Kong into a greater Bay Area in southeastern China. That would bring together, 15 or 16 municipalities into a huge development area, with the idea being, and now they're telling the Hong Kong young people, don't just restrict yourself to a Cantonese-speaking world, do not just restrict yourself to little Hong Kong, but join this big Mandarin-speaking engine of growth. And so the question is, why don't Hong Kong people, Hong Kong young people in particular, seem very excited about this possibility? And it's because that they know that when they go across the border into the Greater Bay Area, all of a sudden a number of their social media applications will not work. They will not have access to various websites that they value. They know they will not be able to access a free press. And that means a lot to them, whether one likes it or not. So I think that that is how I would answer the question. It is a commitment to values, however imperfectly they are ever being realized or implemented, whether in Hong Kong's past or its present.
Well, given how many questions we have in the room, we're going to take 3 questions and then process them accordingly. So, the 2 gentlemen in the front and the lady sitting in the back.
My name's Arnold Zeitlin, and I've been working in Hong Kong on and off for the past 20 years. Excuse me. Harry, you just took my question away from me. I was going to ask about the impact of the effort to make a Pearl River Delta economy was going to have on the future of Hong Kong. And 2, I was going to also ask, if you think that protests will continue, what is the level of toleration by both the Hong Kong government and the party in Beijing? I mean, we've been here for more than an hour and nobody's mentioned the Communist Party.
Next question.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I'm wondering if China could shut this down by allowing Carrie Lam's successor to be elected. Remember, China's game is to just survive a quarter century more. That's all they have to do. And as unlikely as that seems, that they would allow that, it is certainly an interesting method to survive a quarter century more. And then they get to own the place with no restrictions from the party.
And the 3rd question. Oh, okay. Well, the lady in red, please.
Well, thank you for the wonderful speech. I'm a student from the College of William and Mary. I just have 2 brief questions on Hong Kong and Taiwan. So what are some of the implications we can get from...
Speak loudly.
Oh, sorry. What are some of the implications we can get from Taiwan's loss of Solomon Islands as an ally? And also, do you think the U.S. will leverage the U.S.-Hong Kong Policy Act of 1992 to intervene the issue relating to Hong Kong? And will that be factored into the U.S.-China trade war? Thank you.
Well, the Solomon question is not directly related to the topic of today's discussion, but if anyone has any insights to share.
I think it's very related because this is what my last point is, implications for Beijing, what Beijing should do. So this is part and parcel of Beijing ways of thinking. And I think that it's very clear after losing all of these allies, now we have 14, we as in Taipei now has only 14 governments and plus the Vatican that recognizes it. So actually, I've already been saying this, what if there's no more ally left? The really only implication is that Taiwan or the future president will not go anywhere in transit. She'll actually have to go somewhere because there's nobody that recognizes her government. Besides that, as a practicality, the 14 allies plus Vatican constitute such a small percentage of trade and investment. And Taiwan can go to countries with the Taiwan passport. You can go to more countries than a Chinese person with the mainland Chinese passport, visa-free. So what is the implication of really having allies? I've asked these questions actually in government agency discussions and talks with people who are actually involved. And I think this is just something that is actually working again for the DPP, in the sense that as if you look at more and more surveys, the harder Beijing tries, and this is exactly what's happening in Hong Kong, press harder, press harder. What is the point of marginalizing? And it cost them, the last derecognition cost $500 million for a place that has less than 1 million people. So what is the point of it? The point is we've got the money to spend, but there's no other point really to prove. And it's just creating more and more backlash among voters. So I think the biggest issue is this disconnect in terms of intelligence in Beijing. What's happening in Hong Kong, what's happening in Taiwan, through marginalization, through pressing harder, through trying to get people to go to Greater Bay Area, proposing solutions that neglect bottom-up discussions of what really needs to be done, is something that somehow Beijing hasn't quite learned. I was hopeful the last few years that I thought Xi Jinping was learning both ways but trying to reach a compromise, but it does not seem so. And I think the latest derecognition is signs again that there's a lot of hard money being spent on things that don't translate into Taiwanese people voting the way Beijing wants, if that is their goal. So.
The other two questions, Harry and Delina.
Okay, well, let me take a couple of them. As I said, I'll wait until I go to this conference on the Greater Bay Area before I answer any questions about it. I'd be fascinated to see how they present it and how they present it as more than simply an economic opportunity for Hong Kong and its young people. The other questions had to do with basically how Beijing and the Hong Kong government will respond as the protests continue, which I think they will, and how will the United States respond. I think that obviously the Hong Kong government has basically just simply said no. As I sometimes joke, it's that old line, what part of no don't you understand? And this is basically a very characteristic response to these kinds of protests in many authoritarian systems. The belief that to show strength is absolutely vital. That to compromise or to accommodate is to show weakness, and therefore you cannot compromise or accommodate. I think this is a fundamental misreading. As I see it, this precisely shows weakness. It shows a frightened government in Beijing. Oh my God, if we accommodate this, what will happen next? And the problem is when you let these grievances accumulate by not accommodating them, by not getting ahead of them, by assuming it's only economic benefit that matters, you get yourself into this situation. So I think they really are digging themselves into a hole where they mistakenly believe that the only answer is to crack down harder and harder against the Hong Kong people and against the people in Taiwan who are resisting one country, two systems. As to what the United States should do about it, as I said, I'm concerned about taking away what I call Hong Kong's most favored city status because it will hurt people that we don't want to hurt. I actually think that the answer may lie in what I just wrote down, first time I thought of the phrase, not quiet diplomacy, but loud diplomacy. I think basically this, as I said, this whole situation is actually very embarrassing to the Chinese government. And my sense is that the more embarrassed they become by the sense of an unwillingness to accommodate their own people, that this is a feeling that we should not discourage, might I say. In other words, I think that simply speaking out and speaking truth to power, so to speak, is probably as effective an approach as would be revoking this most favored city status. As for the specific financial sanctions that would be mandated in the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, because Shirley's in the financial world, she can raise some of the questions about the feasibility and implementationality, if that's a word, about how difficult it would be to actually implement it, although it has the benefit of being much better targeted. So I'll see if she wants to speak to that.
Actually, I wanted to, of course, play the devil's advocate. You can see discussions at home are difficult. Harry's the ever pessimist. And I think Peter's question is a very good one. I'm an optimist. I think that there is room for Beijing to decide the way to end this is to allow the CE to be elected. And I'd love to hear what Delina thinks the original thinking of this is, but this has always been problematic, that the chief executive does not belong to any party, cannot be selected, and it's always, even though the legislative council election is also very important, the district election as well, each one is only an indicator. The CE is the ultimate, and I think you're right. This is the way to bridge it, and I think if Beijing were to listen to us now, they would say, yes, we agree. This is all very important. We're going to win this, do that, and respond, and I think the issue, of course, is how a CE nomination is selected, and this is still the basic problem. The basic problem is in June, that protesters already came up with 5 demands. This is like a business negotiation. They asked for these things, and at the time in June, I already said, if they retract the bill and think of something, some kind of compromise on some of the others, like not calling the protesters riots, they're actually easy compromises. I think that the protest would have lost some of its strength, momentum early on. Now it's too little, too late, because it's like a negotiation, the price has changed. It's not these 5 things anymore. The whole world has woken up to the fact that there is something deeply flawed in the system and the way the government is responding. But now, of course, you can see shadows of what Beijing wants people to say, because now there are op-eds everywhere saying that we should go back to what happened last time. So last time around, after the students protested for 79 days, what did Carrie Lam actually at the time on behalf of the government suggest was one man, one vote. The nomination is restricted. And now you can see that they're asking people to write about this in a way to kind of come back to it. And there's no takers for that now. And this is another problem. They're on the defensive. They keep on backtracking. And of course, many people said Hong Kong people should have taken that last deal 5 years ago. But that is just a gone discussion. The deal is not there, and people are not there either. And people are younger and younger. They're growing up and growing up. And they're growing up with memories of these protests that we did not come into this world with. So I think that Beijing would be trying it, but there's no process for them to try out what kind of CE nomination would be appropriate to pacify the people. Something is wrong with the intelligence, so that there's no way for them to gauge. Public policy failure is also what Harry is working on. And this system makes it very difficult for Beijing, even with good intention, to come up with something. So they're just doing it completely blindly right now.
And Delina?
Well, I agree with absolutely everything that was said. And, you know, the idea of opening up the process for a chief executive, that was the umbrella movement. That was, in effect, that was the trigger for the umbrella movement. In 2007, it was said that by 2017, we could possibly get to universal suffrage. And 2014, the Chinese government said, whoa, you know, we're not going to do that, and get used to it. And that was a big trigger for the umbrella movement. And so, as Shirley says, that was that fight, and now they're upping the ante. But I think also that, and I also agree with the point that if you look at the fact that Article 23 has never been enacted, that is a searing fact for the Chinese, which is we gave in to the Article 23 in 2004. See, we gave in, and look what we have. It just gets worse and worse and worse. They don't, you know, nobody's ever satisfied. And so they don't have a mindset that says, what's our way through this? What is our way to ameliorate the problem? Because they're always looking backwards, not forwards. And I mean, Margaret Thatcher said to Deng Xiaoping at the signing ceremony for the joint declaration, why did you pick 2047? Why did you pick 50 years? And he said to her, because by 2047, we will look more like you. So he had a sense that has just been discredited, that the gulf between us would be so narrow that it won't matter what happens in 50 years. We'll all be alike. And in fact, the opposite has happened. So I don't think they think in terms of we'll do the CE and then, we'll have 25 years of comedy between us and all will be well. I don't think that is the mindset at this point. It is how we must make this city understand that it belongs to us. It will not be the vanguard for democracy. It will not be the vanguard for these freedoms, anything but. And so they're not looking for liberalization between now and 2047. They are looking for the opposite. So I agree with you. If they would announce this tomorrow, it would be huge. They would diffuse so much if they would say, even if they didn't do full democracy or full universal suffrage for the CE, but they really genuinely opened it up, they would buy themselves so much goodwill. But that just isn't, I think, how they perceive the problem they have.
I think that is worth the price of everybody coming. That line, we will look like you. I'm sure he meant we will be rich. Our cities will have modern skyscrapers, but we will not be like you. And that's the difference, is that this is not just about having fancy new airports and high-speed rail and all the infrastructure that the Chinese like to talk about. Yes, China looks better than the United States in those areas, but in every other way, or I shouldn't say every, in most other ways, it is not. And the question is, are the Hong Kong people, especially the young people, satisfied with that, what some would call a Faustian bargain? Basically, give up your values for the sake of economic prosperity. And the Chinese are making a bet that they will, and I'm expressing a doubt that they will.
Moving on, one last set of 3 questions. The gentleman in the back, the gentleman, and the 2 gentlemen on this side. And if you have more questions, always
on?
feel free
Oh,
to linger on
Ah.
after the event.
Thanks. Steve Winters, independent consultant. I think it was about 2 years ago, the government of Hong Kong had a big delegation in D.C., and they had a meeting over at expensive local hotel, big banquet, and the speaker was the financial officer of Hong Kong, and basically he gave this presentation. Well, American corporations, this is a great place to be. The sort of trying to encourage people to come over there and set up their headquarters. But he actually devoted a large part of his talk to the problem, this problem of the young people in Hong Kong. And he said, we've always been this financial center. He said, our young people don't want to go into finance. They don't want to work for a bank. They don't want to be, the desk job. They blah, blah, blah. And so jumping to the greater Bay Area, to get to the question, the concept is not, as I understand, is not to absorb Hong Kong. Quite the contrary. Each part of this greater Bay Area is supposed to have its own distinctive purpose. And Hong Kong is supposed to be the financial hub in this Bay Area. And so the whole idea of keeping their special laws and the attractiveness to foreign corporations is part of the plan. But the point is, if the kids don't want to go into finance, what are you going to do with the kids if the purpose of the Hong Kong being there is to be the financial center for there? And so that's, in my mind, where I see a bunch of kids running around the street. We want our freedom, we want our freedom, we want our freedom, i.e. to find myself. And this guy said, they all want to go into express their artistic selves and this and that and this and that. So this seems to be a perspective that hasn't quite come up in what you've said, but maybe it was there implicitly.
Hi, Jonathan Wolfish with Legislative Strategies. The American Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong issued a statement, I believe it was last week or 2 weeks ago, expressing their continued support for the existing Policy Act of '92, and that could be read as warning Congress not to go ahead and pursue the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. Now, not heeding that warning, Congress is going ahead with the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, as well as the Protect Hong Kong Act. Is this misguided by Congress? And if these bills become law, do you foresee American companies starting to move out of Hong Kong in greater numbers to somewhere else in the region?
Hi, I'm Garrett Van der Wees. Thank you very much for your excellent presentations. I wanted to ask Harry and Shirley to elaborate a little bit more on how Hong Kong and Taiwan are influencing each other. I think Shirley already answered my first question, that in Taiwan, what is happening in Hong Kong is really a warning that one country, two systems isn't going to work. And the most recent opinion poll in Taiwan shows more than 90% of the people reject it. It was never popular in the first place. And even the Kuomintang is basically saying we are not for one country, two systems. The other side of the coin is how Taiwan, as an example of a free and democratic place, is influencing the students in Hong Kong in particular. Joshua Wong, just a few weeks ago, the first thing he did when he came out of prison, he went to Taiwan, talked to his friends of the Sunflower Movement, so there's quite an interaction there. I just came back from a conference in Europe, a world conference of overseas Taiwanese. The main speaker was Agnes Chow, and so they are talking to each other, and for the young people in Taiwan, they are looking, in Hong Kong, they are looking at Taiwan as an example. So freedom and democracy is much more important now than was in previous occasions.
3 questions. Are the kids in Hong Kong too naive? Is the Congress too misguided? And is Taiwan too influential in motivating the developments in Hong Kong?
No, these are for you.
I'm going to take on 1 and 3 briefly, and then send it to my smarter panelists for any nuance I didn't catch. But I think the Greater Bay Area is a very interesting point, because I have so many students who would love to work in finance in Hong Kong, but they can't get those jobs. And the reason is because most of the financing is done by Chinese companies. So what do you need? You need to basically speak Mandarin, have connections in China. So what do my students really do who take classes from me in Chinese University of Hong Kong? The best you can hope for is be in back office at JP Morgan. So you're not the guy running and getting the business, getting the commission. So the first part is training Hong Kong people to actually do things that are competitive with their, cousins from the north. This is one issue I see practically both in my Wall Street experience as well as my academic life in helping young people. And the Greater Bay Area right now, the way it's structured is really just waiting for places to be ready to take over Hong Kong is the way a lot of people read this. I'm not saying that's true, but this is the way to read it. Until Shenzhen and Shanghai can replace Hong Kong, we have nowhere to go. So China says, let's keep Hong Kong, the goose that lays the golden egg. We're just going to keep it running, because what other choice do you have? But does that help our young people? No. But if you look at youth unemployment number in Hong Kong, it is very low. It's lower than 3%. But they're not jobs that young people want. So there's a really big disparity. We train our students, this is very much the high-income trap that I'm writing about. Same thing in the United States. We teach them liberal arts courses, philosophy, history, political economic theory, and they graduate and they say, what do I do now? I have a liberal arts education from UVA to do what? The skills you need are a mismatch, and the skills in Hong Kong that we prepare the students for is no match for going up north to do business, for example. And Hong Kong has basically, it's a one-industry town. It's finance and real estate. And our financial secretary, Paul, is right to say that, there are lots of jobs for it if we keep that going, but it's a really deep and complicated issue. That's number 1. And number 3, about Hong Kong and Taiwan influencing each other. This is very, very important, because I've been teaching about cross-strait relations in Hong Kong for the last 10 years. For the first few years, there were no takers. I'm teaching, and who takes my classes? Mainland Chinese students. They can't wait, because they want to come to Hong Kong and take a class on Taiwan and ask the Taiwanese professor questions that they can never ask. And same thing, I teach at UVA, and I teach classes about China and Taiwan, and mainland Chinese students are the most important source of my students, because they come to the United States and they want to take classes they've never taken before. But Hong Kong students, it's a different story. They used to be taking finance and other courses, but the last few years, I've just had a wait list. It's incredible how people think of Taiwan as the new norm. And I said, when did Taiwan become the new norm? It's really fascinating. But I think that Taiwan is very much important to Hong Kong in seeing the possibilities. because people need to imagine their future. And I'll come back to Peter. I kind of disagree. The CCP, and now we're going to mention the CCP twice now. CCP does not just need, they need more than a quarter century, because young people today are not looking at 2047. They want to know where their future is. And people buying apartments in Hong Kong, most of our real estate in Hong Kong are leasehold. So they want to know what is going to happen. Property rights need to be respected. And it's very hard to say property rights are being respected when companies are being forced to do things that are not commercially driven. And so we see that every day with state-owned enterprises, and more so with multinationals based in Hong Kong. So people have the right to think twice, and the most liquid investments are going first. So I think that's very problematic. But to come back to Gary's question about Hong Kong and Taiwan, I think there's one thing that's troubling actually about Taiwan, because there's so much attention now on what's happening in Hong Kong. Taiwan suddenly is in the spotlight, and is actually not quite sure what to do. So we just actually visited a few agencies in Taiwan, and they didn't have any refugee law. But Hong Kong people are coming to Taiwan, knocking on the door and saying, we're refugees. Taiwan says, we're refugees. How can you be refugees? So they took 27 refugees as of this August, but they didn't have any refugee law, so they had to come up with something. And Tashi is here from Tibet, and you were in Taiwan in the summer. Same thing with Tibetans living in Taiwan, Taiwan receiving His Holiness the Dalai Lama. All of these are very complicated issues for the DPP, and they have tried to really stay away from it. Because, of course, besides the United States and CIA, who's the biggest troublemaker for Beijing and the Hong Kong protests? Must be Taiwan. So basically, when Joshua Wong and Agnes, all of them went to Taiwan, this is, of course, all over the newspaper, in the state media in China, that the Taiwanese are just stirring all of this up. But of course, I like to say, if the Taiwanese can pay the protesters, surely it could pay off some of the protesters in Taiwan. But it's a serious allegation about something totally not serious. I think that Taiwan is an example in terms of building a democracy, building an institution, and safeguarding rights for primarily ethnically Chinese people. When so many people in Beijing say that democracy is just counterintuitive to ethnic Chinese, and that it's countercultural. All of these allegations, Taiwan is living proof that it may not be perfect, but the biggest enemy to this not so perfect democracy is actually China. And I think that Hong Kong is living through this more intensely than Taiwan has in the last 30 years, with the state controlling so much of the companies, media. And I know Harry has a lot to say about the Greater Bay Area.
Well, not much more, but let me just tell you one story about the question about Hong Kong people and the young people in the financial sector. Again, an anecdote is just illustrative of something. It's not data, because it's only one thing. But I had a student once who was educated in the United States, a Hong Konger, went back to Hong Kong, very keen on going into the financial sector, got an entry-level job, but then realized very quickly that as a Hong Kong person who did not have contacts on the mainland, there was a very, very strong, I'm not even sure it was a glass ceiling, concrete ceiling, bamboo ceiling. She was not going to get promoted because mainland students have guanxi. Hong Kong students don't, and therefore she's now doing something totally different. I think she enjoys what she's doing. But basically, we have to realize that the financial sector in China, and including Hong Kong, is very different from the financial sector in the United States, for example. So there may be a reason why Hong Kong people, young people, don't want to go into finance. There are limited opportunities unless they bring to the table family and other connections across the border. One point that I'm surprised Shirley hasn't mentioned, I'm really happy to fill in, is that we can kind of either argue with each
Can
other
I
or
live with you
reinforce.
guys from now on?
Yeah, we have so much fun doing this stuff, you wouldn't believe it. But I think that when young people in Hong Kong look at Taiwan, it's not just that Taiwan is a democracy. There are other values that they see advocated, protected in Taiwan, and that they admire. Gay marriage, for example. This is a beacon for gays across Asia. This is the first Asian country that has legalized gay marriage. This is very attractive to young people throughout the region, including in Hong Kong. The idea of a green economy that's also very, very attractive to young people in Hong Kong. The fact that Taiwan has the first female president who is not what we call a legacy of a political family. Korea has had a female president because she was the daughter of a former president herself. But Tsai Ing-wen had no particular political pedigree. She was a very skilled bureaucrat and trained as a lawyer. So I think that these are some of the other values that Hong Kong young people admire as they look at Taiwan. Finally, as for the question about would American multinationals leave if the United States government were to adopt some of the pieces of legislation that we've been talking about, I think that the real issue is what would Beijing have done that would then require or tempt or persuade the U.S. government to pass this legislation. That's the real problem. It really is not in our hands in the U.S., it's in Beijing and Hong Kong's hands. And I think that that's what they are looking at. So that's how it answered the question. We have to kind of understand a causal link here. The withdrawal of most favored city status would be the result of other developments, which I really hope do not occur. That is what would cause the U.S. Firms to leave, just as the adoption of the extradition law would have had a similar impact. How do we know we will not be the target of a kind of a request for extradition from Beijing for something that we or our staff allegedly did?
Delina, do you have anything to add?
I think the expertise was to my left, so.
Oh, was that lovely mutually complimentary discussion? We are almost 10 minutes over the time, but thank you very much for joining us. Please join us in thanking our panelists. Again, sorry we weren't able to take all the questions, but feel free to linger on and talk to our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Oh, thank you.
So what you say
That was
afterwards,
really
and then sort of
People were leaving.
afterwards with even more enthusiasm.
This is
I said
real.
it before. That was a wonderful, wonderful talk.
Hi.
Oh, thank you. Coming from you, that means a lot. Thank you.
Hi.
But you know, I think the police issue, this is where it's really the government's fault. It's a political issue that cannot be resolved on the ground. It cannot. It's a political issue. So the police are being sacrificed. They were really hurt, so they had riot, basically police riot. Yes, but they were beaten up, so they started using protesters, and this is now becoming like. Oh yeah. I think this might go on, but I think the police really have been so ruthless that they have to retaliate. Everyone wanted to fight for that. Basically, you can't help but want to beat up the protesters for their release after so many weeks of injustice and overtime. At the same time, they are using violence, and the protesters have to protest against it. Basically, it's the government's fault. The government's completely ruining.
I don't know. I don't live in Washington anymore. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and Hong Kong, so I'm far, far away from here. But people that I've talked to say that, first of all, the bill will be amended before it comes to a final vote. In particular, it's very unusual for a law to mandate that the president do something. It's almost always a so-called national security or national interest waiver. So I cannot imagine that any president would sign a bill that requires him to do something without giving him any discretion. So that just is the most obvious thing that comes to mind. Whether he would sign it even if it were changed, I just don't know. It depends on the content and depends on how he sees it fitting into the broader relationship with